The outer world, with all its harsh words, betrayals, and unmet expectations, is not the master of your emotional life. The moment you believe that someone else must change before you can feel free, you have surrendered your divine authorship. True forgiveness begins not in the act of forgetting or in the verbal release of another, but in the recreation of yourself within your imagination. There lies the holy place, the inner sanctuary where you alone are sovereign. When you retreat into this sacred space and construct a version of yourself untouched by bitterness, you step into the very law that shapes the universe. You become the cause. When you close your eyes, the outer world fades. You are left with thought, feeling, and vision. And it is in this invisible theater that you may do the only work that matters, the creation of assumption. The error many fall into is thinking that forgiveness is a long, emotional journey, one that requires time, apologies, compensation. But these are shadows. Forgiveness is not a result. It is a conscious identity. To forgive is to no longer identify yourself with the wound. It is to walk mentally in a state of wholeness. And the only place you can enter that state at will is in your imagination. Imagine now, just for a moment, that the event which hurt you never had the power to define you. Go deeper. Imagine that it did happen, but it changed you in the most liberating way. You rose above it. You found peace in it. You became stronger for it. The one who hurt you no longer has a throne in your mind. That is not wishful thinking. That is assumption. And what you assume, what you persist in assuming, must become fact. What would it look like if you no longer carried the story? What tone would your voice hold if it was not heavy with memory? How would your face appear if it were not sculpted by resentment? Begin to see that version of yourself. Feel how light the body becomes when it is not constantly rehearsing injustice. Feel how gentle the breath becomes when the mind is not fighting the past. This too is not fantasy. This is your sanctuary, the inner world where you create the self that will walk into tomorrow. When you forgive in imagination, you are not pretending that nothing happened. You are deciding that who you are is no longer the one who was harmed. That identity dissolves in the light of your assumption. You are not forced to carry old wounds into new experiences. They do not belong to you unless you accept them. Every moment you spend identifying as the one who was hurt, you extend the life of the pain. But every moment you spend feeling yourself free, you begin to write a new story. There is no power in waiting for justice, no power in demanding closure. Those who wait to be freed by outer means will never be free. But the one who retreats into imagination and feels himself already at peace, that one moves heaven and earth, because the law responds not to effort, not to morality, not even to reason. It responds to state. You must enter the state of forgiveness, the state of peace, the state of freedom. And the door to that state is your own imagination. You may say, but I don't feel like I've forgiven. That is not a problem. Feeling follows imagination. If you persist in the assumption, the feeling will come. Night after night, close your eyes and walk in the scene. Picture yourself speaking with ease. Imagine encountering the one who wronged you and smiling. Imagining hearing news about them and feeling nothing. Imagine your life as if they never left a mark. These imaginal acts are not passive. They're the tools by which reality is rewritten. You are not bound by memory. You are not required to relive old scenes. The outer world only reflects what the inner world sustains. Withdraw your attention from the injury. Give it to the image of your freedom. Do this again and again, gently, without strain. In time, that new self you assumed will feel natural. And when it does, the world will shift to match it. There is no timeline. Forgiveness in imagination is instant. The only delay is resistance. But if you are willing to let go of the right to be wounded, the right to blame, and the desire to be validated, you will step into the only real power there is, the power to choose your own state. That choice happens now, not tomorrow, not when they apologize, not when justice is served. Now, in your imagination, in the quiet inner space where the unseen creates the scene. You were never meant to be a prisoner of your history. You are the creator of your present. Begin tonight. Close your eyes and see yourself free. See yourself laughing again. See yourself no longer remembering the story that once bound you. That is the work. And when done persistently, faithfully, with feeling, it becomes life. Understand that the past only has power if you re-identify with it. Every time you replay the scene, you reactivate it. Instead, rewrite the inner script. Imagine the incident resolved. There is a hidden truth most are unwilling to accept. The past is powerless unless you bring it back to life. It holds no authority of its own. It cannot walk into your present without your permission. The past is not a thing that happened. It is a story you continue to tell. And each time you tell it, each time you relive the emotion, you are not simply remembering, you are recreating. You are calling it back into form with the same energy and the same tone it had when it first occurred. And so it lives again, not because it is real, but because you made it real once more in the only place that matters, your imagination. Every event that has ever taken place in your life exists now only as memory. It cannot act on its own. It cannot breathe without your breath. But when you return to it mentally, when you speak of it, react to it, and feel it as if it just happened, you are not moving through time, you are moving through state. The state of being wounded, the state of being wronged. And as long as you live in that state, you invite its fruits into your present world. You see the same pattern in new people. You attract similar circumstances. You feel stuck. But it is not because life has cursed you. It is because you are loyal to a script you forgot you were writing. What must be understood is that you are not a passive reader of the story. You are the author. And authors can revise. The page is never final until you decide it is. You may say, but the facts are real. Perhaps they are. But facts are not fate. What matters is not that it happened, but how you hold it now. The question is never, what did they do, but always, who am I being in relation to it? If you see yourself as the wounded, the forgotten, the betrayed, then that is who you remain. But if you revise the identity, you revise the experience. And reality must conform to the revision. You have the power to rewrite any scene in your mind. If the conversation ended in tears, imagine it ending in peace. If the relationship ended in betrayal, imagine it ending in understanding. If the goodbye was bitter, imagine it was kind. You do not do this to change the facts. You do this to change your state, because the facts no longer exist, but the state is alive as long as you allow it to be. And every state draws into your life its own echo. Pain draws pain, peace draws peace. This is not denial, it is creation. To revise the past in imagination is not to pretend it never happened. It is to decide who you are in spite of it. You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to become beyond it. And imagination is the only place where that choice becomes real. When you assume that the conflict resolved, that the hurt faded, that the relationship ended in harmony, you begin to feel the emotions of someone who is no longer broken. And those emotions, though invisible, are the true architects of your life. You must be willing to stop rehearsing your wounds, stop telling the story to others, stop seeking sympathy for your scars. Every retelling is a reinvestment. Every conversation about the pain is an invitation for it to live again. The past cannot come back unless you call it. And when you stop calling it, it will finally be buried. You were not born to be defined by a moment. You were born to define yourself by vision. And vision does not come from what has happened, it comes from what you are willing to see. So see the past as complete. See the scene rewritten. See yourself walking away from it, not as someone who lost, but as someone who learned, someone who rose, someone who now chooses peace, because peace is who they are. Let the memory fade into fiction. Let the image dissolve. You are not required to keep it alive. Close your eyes and feel yourself beyond it, not as someone still trying to escape it, but as someone for whom it has no weight at all. That feeling is your freedom. It does not come from others. It comes from the choice to dwell in the state of resolution. You are the only one who can revise the past in your imagination. And that revision is more real than the memory, because it becomes the root of a new emotional tone. The tone of your being is what determines what you attract. If you change the tone, you change the echo. The world around you is only a mirror reflecting what you are inside. So if you want the world to stop showing you the same pain in different forms, stop assuming that you may begin tonight. Go into that scene one last time, not to relive it, but to transform it. Sit in the quiet. Picture it playing out with peace. Hear different words. See a different outcome. And most of all, feel the new state. Dwell in it long enough that it becomes familiar. Return to it again tomorrow and again the day after that. Do not force, do not strain. Gently reimagine until the new version feels more real than the old. That is when the shift begins. And when it does, life will follow. To truly move on, one must understand that the future does not unfold from effort, but from assumption. You cannot reach peace by chasing it. You reach it by assuming it. The question is never, how do I forget what happened? But rather, what is it like now that I'm free from it? The shift begins not by looking back, but by looking forward, not to what might happen someday, but to what already is, in imagination. For the mind does not wait for the world to change. The world waits for the mind to change its state. That state is everything. When you assume the end, you occupy the version of yourself where the hurt has no voice. You no longer carry it like a badge. You no longer offer it to every conversation. It becomes a whisper of the past, a closed door in a long hallway of becoming. And that closure, true closure, does not arrive from apologies, time, or logic. It arrives the moment you choose to stand in the version of yourself where healing is already complete. That version of you already exists. It does not need to be built. It needs to be occupied. To assume the end is to walk directly into that identity. Begin by asking yourself quietly, what does my life feel like now that I have fully moved on? Do not answer with logic. Do not analyze the timeline. Let the question awaken an image. See yourself in your mind's eye standing taller, speaking less often of what used to dominate your thoughts. Notice how people respond to you differently, not because they changed, but because your tone has. You are no longer someone recovering. You are someone who has already recovered. This is not make-believe. This is the law by which experience is shaped. If you can feel the tones of relief now, the world will align to that vibration. But if you wait for the outer world to change first, you will wait forever. The cause is not out there. The cause is always a something. Try this now. Picture a version of yourself that no longer remembers the pain emotionally. You might remember the facts, yes, but the emotional charge is gone. It no longer grips you. It no longer dictates your energy. In that state, you breathe slower, you smile easier, you stop looking over your shoulder. This version of you does not spend time imagining justice or wishing to be understood. This version is too full of peace to need anything from the past. To assume the end means to become the result before the world confirms it. You do not need proof to feel whole. You feel whole and the proof appears. This is not a game of waiting. It is a game of choosing. The moment you stop trying to forgive and instead feel as though you already have, the inner world begins to settle. And when the inner world is still, the outer world softens. You meet people who no longer trigger old memories. You encounter conversations that speak to who you are now, not who you used to be. You may find yourself thinking, but I still remember the pain, I still get triggered. That is fine. It does not matter if old feelings surface. What matters is what you return to. When those thoughts come, gently turn away from them and return to the state of the end. See yourself again, smiling for no reason. Hear your own voice in the quiet, steady and relaxed. Feel yourself engaged in the present moment, as if nothing behind you has the power to haunt you. Do not fight the old state. Just stop feeding it. Every identity is a home you either choose to live in or leave behind. If you keep revisiting the past, you're renewing the lease on a house you were meant to outgrow. Instead, take up residence in the new home, the one where your heart is light, your thoughts are new, and your emotions are not echoes of old events. You do this not by force, but by dwelling in the assumption that this home is already yours. Walk differently. Speak as if your voice is no longer carrying a history of wounds. Think as if your mind has been wiped clean of sorrow. Behave as if the memory has no weight. This is not pretending. It is real in imagination. And what becomes real in imagination will always become real in the world. Life reshapes itself around the one who has already moved on internally. You are not required to heal over time. You are only required to assume you are healed now. The body will respond, the emotions will follow, and the circumstances around you will shift because they are only there to reflect who you believe yourself to be. Let go of needing closure. Let go of needing time. Let go of needing validation. Step directly into the end. Feel the relief as if the story has already ended with peace. Do not wonder how. Just accept that it has. That's the secret. That's the power. You are no longer the one becoming. You are the one who already is. There is a silent pact most people unknowingly enter into with their own pain, to keep it alive by retelling it. Each time the story is spoken, no matter how small the detail, no matter how justified the telling, the energy of the experience is fed. And what is fed grows. What is remembered with emotion becomes current. This is the invisible mechanism by which so many remain trapped in states they no longer want. They speak of what hurt them, not knowing that in speaking of it, they reaffirm it as their reality. The spoken word is not a passive event. It is the movement of consciousness into form. When you say, "They wronged me," you are not merely describing the past. You are recreating its presence in the now. Silence is not weakness. It is not suppression. It is sacred power. In silence, you stop breathing life into the memory. You stop offering it space in your current identity. You let it die its natural death. The moment you resist the urge to speak of what wounded you, you allow it to dissolve. But silence is not just the absence of words. It is the presence of new vision. It is the space in which you begin to see yourself differently. In that silence, you do not stare at what happened. You do not replay the event like a scene in a film. You turn inward and imagine the version of yourself who has risen far above the need to explain, to justify, or to be understood. You begin to feel the quiet strength of someone who knows that peace is more valuable than being right. And in that state, something remarkable occurs. You become immune to the past, not because it never happened, but because it no longer owns a place in your identity. Words have power. They do not simply describe what is, they shape what is becoming. When you speak from pain, you plant it deeper. When you speak from love, you water peace. This is not metaphor, this is the law of being. The tongue is not neutral. It creates. And what you create with your words becomes the shape of your world. If you desire to move on, to truly be free, then let your silence speak louder than your story. Let your imagination fill the space where your mouth used to defend. Speak not of betrayal. Speak not of disappointment. If the urge to vent arises, take it into the inner sanctuary and revise the state. See yourself victorious, healed, radiant, with a wisdom that no injury could ever take from you. That is the conversation worth having, the silent one where you become new. There is no freedom in rehearsing wrongs. You do not owe the world your story. You owe yourself peace. And peace cannot live in the same space as retold pain. Ask yourself, what do you want more? To be heard or to be healed? Because often you must choose. And healing is quiet. It does not require applause. It does not demand agreement. It happens invisibly, in the stillness of your own heart, where you decide once and for all, I am no longer going to talk about this. To many, silence feels like defeat, but only to the self that identifies with the role of victim. When you step beyond that role, you no longer seek validation. You no longer chase understanding. You become still. And in that stillness, you find something greater than justice, sovereignty. Every word you withhold becomes fuel for the new identity. Every story you do not tell becomes space for a new state to occupy. The transformation is subtle. At first, you may feel the impulse to speak rise like a tide, the need to share, to be heard, to remind someone how they treated you. It may burn in your chest, but if you remain silent and direct that energy inward, it becomes power, pure creative power. You channel it into the image of the self who has already moved on. And then, without needing the world to see it, you become it. You are not required to share your pain for it to be valid, nor are you required to defend your decision to let it go. In fact, the more sacred your healing becomes, the more silence it demands. There is a kind of quiet that terrifies the past. It cannot touch you there. It loses its grip because you stop feeding it with your attention. That quiet is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is the fullness of a new identity forming, one who no longer reacts, no longer explains, no longer feels small in the shadow of what once was. So you must practice this silence, not as punishment, but as refinement. Let others ask questions you no longer feel obligated to answer. Let the mind scream for attention you no longer seek. And in that moment, you will know the silence is working, the new self is growing. In that sacred space where no words are needed, where no stories are retold, you rise, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as the author of a new narrative, one written not in reaction to pain, but in loyalty to peace. You do not have to speak to be seen. You do not have to be heard to be whole. You only have to remain faithful to the inner vision, and that vision, when sustained in silence, becomes louder than anything you could ever say. Anger, though often mistaken for strength, is merely the disguise of attachment. When you feel anger towards someone who has wronged you, what you are really feeling is the thread that still connects you to them. It is the energy line between you and that experience. And as long as that line is charged with your emotion, you remain bound. You are not free, you are reactive. Your identity is still shaped by the echo of that moment. The great misunderstanding is the belief that anger punishes the offender, but it does not. It punishes the one who holds it. And it does so not by fire or rage, but by focus. The more you focus on what was done, the more you anchor yourself to it. The more you relive it in your thoughts, the more it becomes part of your active state. And every state you occupy writes your reality. You must understand that emotion is not neutral. It is magnetic. It draws to you the likeness of what you feel. So if you feel angry, bitter, or vengeful, even if it is justified, you are creating more opportunities for anger, bitterness, and conflict. The law does not care who is right. It only responds to what is being affirmed. And if your mind is affirming injustice through inner dialogue, imagination, or even casual thought, then you are not releasing the wound. You are rehearsing it. And what is rehearsed is reinforced. To detach is not to forget. It is not to excuse. It is to remove your spiritual attention from the injury. Detachment begins the moment you decide to withdraw the emotional charge. The moment you say within, "This no longer defines me. This no longer feeds on my awareness," the cord begins to dissolve. But you cannot do this from the state of anger. Anger insists on being right. Anger needs to explain. It hungers for validation. And as long as you feed that hunger, you remain tethered. So how do you dissolve that cord? You assume peace. You begin by imagining yourself free of it. You picture yourself no longer thinking about them. You see your face at rest, your body relaxed, your mind clear. You hear your own voice speaking lightly. You feel the space between stimulus and response grow wider until one day the event that once triggered pain no longer gets a reaction. That is the true sign of healing. Not that the memory is gone, but that it is powerless. This inner peace must be claimed, not earned. You do not wait for them to apologize. You do not wait for justice to be served. That would be chaining your peace to someone else's behavior. Instead, you rise within. You declare in silence, "I am whole now." And you persist in that assumption until it becomes natural. You may not feel it at first. The emotions may still churn. But the assumption is the seed. If you water it daily in the garden of imagination, the state will grow. And once you enter that state fully, the former attachment will wither. Do not confuse peace with passivity. Peace is not weakness. It is power restrained. It is the decision not to react, not to carry, not to return what was given. When you choose peace in imagination, you shift your identity. You move from the one who is hurt to the one who is overcome. And in doing so, you free yourself from the invisible link that ties you to the other person. That link may have once felt like a cord of resentment, but when peace enters, it becomes a thread of understanding, and eventually nothing at all. You must not underestimate how deeply the mind desires to dwell in anger. It feels alive there. It feels justified. It feels strong. But that feeling is a trap. The strength is temporary. The fire burns only you. And the longer you remain in that heat, the more it consumes your vision. You begin to see the world through that lens, cynical, guarded, suspicious. You speak with a tone of tension. You expect more betrayal. And because imagination is law, it fulfills those expectations with mathematical precision. But there is another way. You can sit alone in a quiet place and say inwardly, "I choose peace." You can let that phrase become a mantra, not just a sentence, but a state. And you can visualize your life on the other side of the cord. You can feel yourself no longer attached to the story, the people, the pain. You can watch yourself walking lightly, smiling gently, and thinking new thoughts. This does not require a ritual. It only requires attention. Wherever your attention goes, energy flows. So let your attention rest on peace. Let it bathe in the image of freedom. The person who hurt you does not need to change. The situation does not need to be different. The only shift needed is your state, and that shift is immediate the moment you refuse to energize the pain with thought. You let the past be past. You do not deny it happened, but you deny it the right to continue shaping your life. And in that quiet, sacred denial, the cord snaps, the bond breaks, you are released. The peace you assume becomes your new magnetic field. It draws to you people, places, and events that match your freedom. And soon you no longer speak of what happened, not because you've buried it, but because it no longer feels relevant. You've become someone new, someone who's not reacting, someone who's not reliving, someone who, without saying a word, is walking in power. The greatest mistake people make when applying the inner laws of consciousness is waiting for their feelings to confirm what they are imagining. They assume that if they don't feel it deeply and immediately, then the assumption must not be working. But the truth is quite different. The world does not respond to fleeting emotion. It responds to sustained assumption. You do not need to feel like you've forgiven in order to begin. You must simply assume that forgiveness has already occurred. Then, from that state, the feeling will gradually rise. It is not instant. It is a process of inner saturation. The seed planted in imagination does not bloom in emotion overnight, but if you persist, the harvest is inevitable. In the early stages of assuming forgiveness, the mind will resist. It will rise with arguments. It will remind you of what they did, how wrong it was, and why you are justified in remaining hurt. These objections are not the truth. They are the echoes of an old state trying to survive. Every state defends its right to remain. When you assume a new identity, the identity of someone who has already let go, you threaten the very structure that the old feelings were built on. Expect resistance, but do not fear it. It is a sign that you are shifting. You do not need to silence the mind by force. You simply need to give it a new image to dwell upon. Begin by constructing a clear and detailed vision of yourself having already forgiven. What would your day look like? What would your conversation sound like? Would you be lighter, more open, more present? Begin to walk yourself through this inner world as if it were already true. Speak in the tone of someone who has no emotional debt. Move through scenes in your mind where you are free from the need to defend, explain, or justify. When you do this, you are not imagining randomly. You are entering a state, and a state, once fully entered, will reshape your life. Each night, before sleep, this is your opportunity. Lie still and drop into that version of yourself who has already released the pain. Picture a simple moment. Maybe you're walking through your home, making tea, or writing a journal entry, but in that moment you carry no bitterness. You are not rehearsing the past. You are not planning a conversation that never comes. You are simply being with ease, with grace, with lightness. That is the tone you want to cultivate. Not high drama, not overwhelming joy, just a quiet, natural tone of peace. That tone, once felt, begins to take root. You may find that on some nights it's difficult. The old feelings come rushing in like waves. The mind begins to argue louder than before, but this is not failure. It is the clearing process. The old state is protesting its removal. Do not argue back. Just return to the scene, gently, persistently, without force. See yourself again, smiling without explanation. Hear your inner voice say, "It's done." Let that phrase become your bridge. It's done, not as a wish, but as a truth accepted, before feeling confirms it. The power lies in repetition. Do not assume once and abandon it. Return to it nightly. Each visit makes the state more familiar, and what is familiar begins to feel natural. This is how the inner world is rewritten, not through emotional outbursts, but through loyal revisiting. The one who continues to return to peace in imagination will find that peace rising naturally in their body, in their tone, in their responses to life. You may be tempted to check for results, to look out into the world for signs, but resist that urge. The only sign that matters is the inner conviction. If you can return to this state again and again without needing proof, you will find that proof will appear without your effort. The world is not your confirmation, your state is. When the state changes, the world changes as a reflection. It is important to remember that the feeling often lags behind the assumption. That is because emotion is the shadow of belief. Belief is not emotion, it is identification. You believe you are the one who has already forgiven, and the feeling must conform in time. If you reverse the order and wait for the feeling before believing, you remain stuck. But if you reverse the logic and say, I believe first, and the feeling will follow, you initiate the law in its proper order. When you wake in the morning, return to that state once more, even for a moment. In the shower, while driving, while eating, pause and feel yourself as the one who has already let go. You are not trying to forgive, you are not becoming someone new, you already are. And this inner knowing becomes the platform from which your outer world is built. Do not be discouraged by the gap between assumption and emotion. That gap is not a void. It is the space where transformation takes place. The assumption is the seed, and the feeling is the soil warming slowly around it. Let it take time. Let it be invisible at first. But above all, let it be constant. Return to the state again and again until it claims you, until you no longer need to act as if you have forgiven, because you realize you already have. Closure is not something the world owes you. It is not something someone else can give. And it is not found in an apology, a conversation, or a final meeting. Closure is not out there in the realm of outer events. It lives within. And it is yours to grant. As long as you are waiting for someone to explain, to change, to acknowledge, you remain bound to a story whose ending is not yours to write. But the truth is, you are the author. And closure happens the moment you stop reading the same chapter over and over and decide the book has already ended. That decision, when made in imagination, is the seed of your transformation. When you rely on life to bring you closure, you are placing your peace in the hands of the very thing that disrupted it. You are giving power to what happened instead of reclaiming your right to move forward. But there is no need to wait. The delay exists only in your belief that something outside of you must occur. The only event required is an inward shift, a moment when you say to yourself, not to the world, not to the other person, but to your own being, it is done. I release it. I am complete. To feel complete is not to forget what happened. It is not to erase it. It is to remove your sense of identity from it. It is to stop carrying it into your present conversations, relationships, and emotions. That memory may remain in the background of your mind like a distant city you once lived in. But it no longer calls to you. It no longer calls to you. It no longer defines your posture, your tone, your thoughts. That is closure, not the disappearance of memory, but the detachment of identity. You do not need to fix the story to end it. You only need to stop entering it. Every time you think about how things could have gone, how they should have ended, how they might still be resolved, you keep the thread alive. You keep the state active. And life will respond to that state with people, situations, and emotions that match it. You will think life is repeating on you when in truth you are repeating the state. But the moment you withdraw your attention from the idea of unfinished business, the script ends. And something remarkable happens. The outer world shifts. People fade from your awareness. Conversations stop arising. The weight leaves your chest. You are no longer living with a question mark in your soul. You are no longer waiting, and in that state of no longer needing closure, you discover you already have it. Imagine now what it would feel like to have nothing left to fix, to hold no resentment, to no longer need the last word. Imagine sitting alone, breathing slowly, and realizing that the chapter has been closed, not by anyone else, but by your own decision. Feel the lightness in that. The freedom in knowing that you do not need to return to it in thought. You do not need to revisit that memory in order to extract something more. What needed to be learned has been learned. What needed to be felt has been felt. And now you choose to feel whole. Closure happens in imagination first. If you want the world to reflect your freedom, you must imagine that you have already moved on. Picture yourself at peace. See your life filled with new people, new scenes, new thoughts. Notice how they no longer resemble the old ones. Your world has shifted, not because someone gave you closure, but because you gave it to yourself. You became the source of your completion. Do not make the mistake of thinking this is passive. It is one of the most active and powerful movements of consciousness. It requires great strength to stop waiting, to stop hoping for a conclusion delivered from outside, but that strength is already within you. The power to declare an end and step into a new beginning does not require permission. It only requires persistence. Each time the thought returns, each time the urge to reopen the book arises, you must gently return to the state of wholeness. Feel it again. Assume it again. That repetition builds a new identity, and the world has no choice but to reflect it. You may not believe at first that you are complete. You may feel the ache of what was left unsaid, the hunger for understanding. That is natural. But you must not feed that hunger. You must not give it a voice. Instead, enter the assumption of one who is already satisfied, one who has received all they need, not from others, but from their own choice to be at peace. In this inner state, the mind stops seeking, the heart stops wandering, the spirit stands still. The silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with new life. New patterns begin to emerge. Your days are no longer haunted by yesterday's echo. You meet new faces who are not reflections of your past, but messengers of your present state. They arrive because you no longer carry the vibration of incompletion. You are no longer a magnet for what needs closure. You are a mirror of what is already whole. So tonight, before the world lulls you to sleep, enter that state. Say within, I am finished with it. I no longer need more. And picture yourself already living that truth. See yourself smiling freely, standing strong, thinking of what lies ahead rather than what lies behind. And know, with quiet certainty, that the world is rearranging itself, not to give you closure, but to mirror the closure you have already chosen. Forgiveness is not a solitary act locked within the chambers of your own mind. It may begin there, in the secret quiet of your imagination, but its effect reaches far beyond you. The moment you assume the state of having forgiven, of having moved on completely, a chain of unseen events begins to unfold. People who once held tight to their own bitterness begin to soften. Conversations you thought could never happen take place effortlessly. Circumstances that seemed unchangeable bend to the tone of your new identity. Because nothing remains untouched by a change in consciousness, not relationships, not history, not even the emotional charge between souls. You may believe that the dynamic between you and another is set in stone, but there is no stone, only state. You and every person you've ever interacted with are bound together not by time or memory, but by energy, the shared tone of your assumptions. If that tone remains rooted in pain, misunderstanding, or conflict, then the bond will echo those qualities again and again. But if one of you shifts, if you shift, the entire dynamic must also change. It does not require effort. It requires alignment. When you enter the state of forgiveness in imagination, something subtle yet powerful happens. You no longer identify with the wounded version of yourself. You no longer see the other person as the one who caused harm. The entire story transforms. And in that transformation, the emotional tie begins to dissolve. It's as if the thread that held you both in a cycle of repetition is cut, not by words, but by your silent willingness to release the pattern. You may not speak to them, They may not know that you've forgiven, but they will feel it. Whether they are near or far, whether they are still in your life or gone entirely, the energy will shift. You are no longer holding them in the prison of your thoughts. You are no longer imagining them as the villain in your story. And when your imagination changes, your world follows. This is not poetic sentiment. This is spiritual law. Do not underestimate what happens when you change the image you hold of someone. If you've been imagining them with tension, with guilt, with regret, and then suddenly you begin to imagine them as free, as kind, as no longer bound to what they did, you are not only freeing yourself, you're giving them a new place to stand. You are lifting the burden of your expectation. You are rewriting the emotional agreement, and that change ripples into the world in ways you may never be able to trace. This is the reason forgiveness cannot be conditional. It must be assumed without proof, without apology, without response. It must be chosen in imagination and persisted in until the tone of your being changes completely. Only then will you begin to see its effects around you. And they may surprise you. People who avoided you suddenly reach out. People who once triggered you now feel neutral. Sometimes, even without contact, you sense something has released. The cord is gone. The pressure is gone, and what remains is peace. What you do for others in imagination is more powerful than what you could ever do in words. Words can be doubted, apologies can be rejected, but inner vision cannot be blocked. When you enter a new state and see another as forgiven, they receive that vibration. It may reach them in a dream, in a moment of reflection, or simply as a feeling they can't explain. But it arrives. And often it inspires them to change as well, not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding the version of them that hurt you. This is the secret many never learn. Your assumptions of others help shape who they are. And when you revise those assumptions in imagination, you give them a path to become something new. If you continue to think of them as cruel, they remain frozen in that role. But if you imagine them as healed, as learning, as rising, you offer them space to grow. That does not mean they always will, but it means you no longer hold them back with your attention. You have become an agent of grace. Do this not for their sake alone. Do it because it lifts you. Every time you imagine peace, you dwell in it. Every time you revise a painful memory with understanding, you place yourself in a higher state, and from that state all things become easier. Not just healing, but creating, attracting, expressing. You find your body relaxing, your conversations deepening, your creativity flowing again. Why? Because you are no longer leaking energy into conflict. You have reclaimed it, gathered it, and redirected it toward wholeness. The impossible becomes easy when the state changes. The conversations you thought would never come suddenly find you. The clarity you longed for arrives without effort. Because the world was never your problem, it was only your reflection. Change the inner tone and the outer shapes adjust themselves accordingly. So tonight, enter that place within. Call to mind the one you have not yet forgiven. Not to relive the wound, but to set it down. Picture them standing before you, and instead of arguing or weeping, see yourself smiling. Not because they were right, but because you no longer need to be hurt. Imagine speaking to them with calm. Imagine walking away without a weight. Imagine your own heart so light that scene, when imagined faithfully, will do more than any real-world conversation ever could. It will transform you. And in that transformation, you will release not only yourself, but them. You do not need more time. You do not need more evidence. You do not need anyone to understand you. The only thing required is the shift, a gentle, firm, quiet shift in your own inner state. That is the root, and all fruit comes from that. You've now seen that forgiveness does not begin with the other, it begins with the self. It begins when you choose to no longer be the one who is wounded, but the one who is now whole. Not because they apologized, not because the past was rewritten, but because you chose to occupy the end, to imagine yourself beyond the pain, to no longer energize what once defined you. That is how the inner world transforms the outer. Every moment you spend reliving the injury is a moment you deny your freedom. But every time you imagine yourself free, the ties weaken. Every act of silence, every refusal to retell the story, every time you return to the state of already being healed, you are realigning with power. The world cannot help but conform to this shift. The people who once triggered you will lose their effect. The need for closure will vanish, and even the weight of your old emotions will begin to lift. All because you assumed what the world never gave: completion. This journey is not loud, it is not dramatic. It happens in small, consistent acts of vision. When you wake and feel the temptation to think as you once did, you stop. You return to the image. You say, I have already forgiven. I am already whole. And you let that become the thread you follow, day after day, night after night, until it is not something you practice, but something you are. The one who walks in the assumption of peace has no need to prove anything. They do not justify, they do not defend. They radiate a quiet certainty that says, what hurt me no longer holds me. That is not fiction, that is reality. A reality you created within and have now stepped into. So let the story close. Let the chapter end. Not with final words from others, but with a final decision from within. I forgive. I let go. I have moved on. And now the world begins anew.